Hello, BookTube. We're continuing with a read-along of the Thomas Covenant novels of Stephen R. Donaldson. This is the thing I've been doing with a couple of other BookTubers. We're doing it since the summer, since July. We're doing one book a month of the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, which is a trilogy, and then the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, another trilogy. We're not doing any of the later books. We're just concentrating on those first 6 books. And now in November we are up to the One Tree, which is the middle volume in the second trilogy. We have only one more book to go, and it's the second trilogy starts off with the wounded land, in which our hero Thomas Covenant returns to the land from our world. He's a citizen of our world. He returns to the magic world of the land, and finds it radically different, racked from end to end with horrible geologic and weather-related catastrophes, and ruled over by literally a bloodthirsty warped version of the Lords of Revelstone from the first trilogy. And it's such a mess. It's such a complete perversion of what the land used to be that Covenant decides in that first book that what he needs to do is save it from itself completely. Not picking apart bits and pieces there, but leaving the land entirely in order to find the One Tree, which is the root and branch of earth power, the earth power that has been perverted in the land, and from the One Tree fashion a new staff of law, a very powerful item that shores up the natural laws of the land, and that it was lost and maybe fell into the hands of Lord Fowl, the villain of the piece. And to do that, Covenant has to leave the land. In other words, Donaldson has to leave everything that he's created so far. And we take a voyage on the Starfarer's Gem, a giant ship. And we don't abandon everything. We have Covenant. We have Lyndon Avery, the human woman that has accompanied him to the land this time. That's the first time that's ever happened. We've met another human in the land, Hyle Troy, but he got there on his own. Lyndon Avery comes with Thomas Covenant. And where Covenant has a supernatural element to him, he has his white gold wedding ring that allows him to focus the wild magic that is inside him when he's in the land, which is beyond any account. It is the ultimate source of power. And earlier in the first trilogy of books, one of the main characters, Lord Morham, tells Covenant that he doesn't have to worry about the ring so much because you are the wild magic. And in this book, that is much more readily obvious. Covenant in the first trilogy barely knows how to use his own ring, and barely knows how to do anything with it at all. This book is not the case. We see him, especially in the second half of The Wounded Land, and then from on, we see him very much from time to time being able to use what is the ultimate power at his discretion, which is both satisfying in a way, because it gets very frustrating in that first trilogy for him not to know what he's doing, but also cautionary, right? Because if you're a writer of a fantasy series and you give one of your characters ultimate power, then you run the risk of having a Deus Ex Machina in every scene. that's I think one of the reasons why Tolkien opted for so-called soft magic in The Lord of the Rings, so that he didn't have Gandalf just saving everything all the time. And it's a definite risk here in this trilogy, because if you make a decision at the start that Thomas Covenant is suddenly going to have more access, more volition over his wild magic, then you have to create something that gets in the way of that, or he can just solve all his problems himself. And Donaldson does that by having Covenant constantly be beaten. In this book, he is bitten, he is stung, he is poisoned. He has, in the chapters that we're reading today, he has effectively his mind wiped. All either by minions of Lord Fowl who want to destroy or co-opt him, or by people that we meet outside the land who want to get rid of his volition so that they can take the white gold ring themselves. And that's what we meet in here. Donaldson doesn't leave the old land behind completely. Once we board that giant ship and head literally away from the map that Donaldson has given us for the first 3 books, we're not without familiar characters. We have a crew of giants. We met one giant, really got to know one giant in the first trilogy, Saltheart Foamfaller. This trilogy is 10,000 years later. We meet a whole crew of giants, and there are many really good characters in that crew. The first is the woman who leads the mission. Pitchwife she herself is tall and magnificent and capable, and yet her husband is a misshapen. He's a hunchbacked giant. Ordinarily, it would be a source of scorn, except the giants are too kind-hearted for that, and theirs is a true love. We also meet the master of the ship, and a giant who's afflicted with earth vision, so that he can see all sorts of supernatural things that are about to happen or that are happening, and that is great. That allows Donaldson a chance to elaborate on the concept of the giants that was so interesting in the first book and so non-Tolkien-esque, for the most part, in the first book. Also, along for this voyage are a few members of the Harukai, the mountain-bred people who gave rise to the Blood Guard in the first trilogy, who are taciturn and extremely physically competent and very, very interesting in their own right. And we follow these people. They go on a quest, and they leave the old land behind. So we meet all sorts of brand new creations, and including the Elohim, these characters featured on the cover, who are the personification of earth power. One of them joins the quest, and also there's a black-skinned, sort of silent, enigmatic figure who is also part of the quest, but he doesn't talk to anybody, and he seems to have a purpose of his own that we'll meet later on. And that quest, in the chapters that we read last time, encounters a desert realm, the Sandhold. And at first they seem like honored guests, but the place is entirely corrupt. And it's also under threat of constant extermination. There are creatures, white, vaguely humanoid creatures that live in the deep desert called sand gorgons, who are immensely physically powerful, unstoppable physically, and who the Kazarine of the Gyre, the main villain of the chapters that we're reading today, constructs through magic. He constructs a kind of a sand doom that occupies the sand gorgons so that his city can thrive, so the sand gorgons aren't just free to destroy everything in their path, because they're mindless and unstoppable. But there is a punishment. There is a way to get a sand gorgon away from the doom long enough to do Kazarine's bidding, and that is to say its name. If you say a sand gorgon's name, it will come and destroy you. It destroy the person who says its name, and then go back. And that is a horrible kind of blackmail, a horrible sword of Damocles to hold over everybody. And there's a climactic moment in the previous bit of the book that we read where two of the Harukai are going to be sacrificed. They're going to be killed on the open sands underneath the walls of the city by being ordered to speak a sand gorgon's name, or an innocent will be killed. So they eventually do. The Blood Guard do, and a sand gorgon comes. And they do their best, but they have no chance of defeating this creature. And once they die, it goes back. It goes away. And we learn in the whole atmosphere surrounding that storyline, to fear the speaking of this name. It will invoke a punishment for which there is no remedy. But doesn't seem to be any other out either here, because Kazarine of the Gyre has wiped Thomas Covenant's mind and made him sort of a thrall who just keeps repeating over and over again, "Don't touch me." And the thin veneer of hospitality that the Sandhold has extended to our questers is gone. They know they're prisoners, and they know they're doomed. They know they need to do something drastic in order to get out from under this, in order to free themselves of this place. And Lynn and Avery has the ability to Covenant has the white gold. She also has mystical abilities that have unlocked since she came to the land. She has the old earth sight that everyone used to have in the first trilogy. She can see the very sinews of health in other people. And she can also extend her earth sight, her health sight, into someone, almost like a good version of a raver. She can almost take over someone. And she worries about this. She gets more introspective as the book goes along. She gets more interesting as the book goes along. And at the climax of this crisis, she decides that the only thing that will save them is if she sends her natural awareness, her healing awareness, into Covenant and brings him back to himself, so that he can command the white gold. Even though she knows that Kazarine of the Gyre is waiting for her to do that, because when he is vulnerable, Kazarine can strike and take the ring for himself. She has to gamble that Covenant will be able to beat that. And there's a wonderful moment, there's a wonderful scene where in the land of her imagination and his, they meet as children, long before the tragedies that have afflicted either one of them. And that is enough of a toehold for Covenant to make his way back. But while he is still most vulnerable, And when Kasrine might be ready to strike, Lyndon Avery forces him to do something that changes the calculus completely. Another huge gamble. She has him speak the name of a Sandgorgon. And all of a sudden, everyone is horrified. The good guys and the bad guys are horrified. They suddenly realize, oh no. They're deep inside the city now. They're not out on the sands watching from high walls. And sure enough, within minutes, they start to feel the pounding on the walls. They start to feel the very bedrock of the whole city being shattered because a Sandgorgon has arrived. And there's a wonderful moment down in the deeps of the Sandhold where the Sandgorgon actually makes its way to the room where all of our heroes are. Pitchwife, for instance, is just assuming they're going to die and tells his wife that he loves her. And then the Sandgorgon is suddenly visible, leaping like a roar down into the chamber. The beast charged as if it meant to drive Covenant through the back wall. No mortal flesh and bone could have withstood that onslaught, but the despiser's venom had only been rendered quiescent by the Elohim. It had not been purged or weakened, and the Sandgorgon itself was a creature of power. The instant before it struck, Thomas Covenant became an eruption of white flame. Wild magic, keystone of the Arch of Time, power that was not limited or subdued by any law except the inherent strictures of its wielder. High Lord Moram had said like a prophecy of fire, "You are the white gold." And Covenant fulfilled these words. An incandescence came upon him. Argent bursts from him as if it from the heart of a silver furnace. The Sandgorgon crashed into Covenant. Impact and momentum knocked him against the wall, but he hardly felt the attack. He was preserved from pain or damage by white fire, as if that flame had become the outward manifestation of his leprosy, numbing him to the limitations of his mortality. A man with living nerves might have felt the power too acutely to let it mount so high. Covenant had no such restraint. The venom was avid in him. The fang scars on his forearm shone like the eyes of the despiser. Almost without thought or volition, he buffered himself against the Sandgorgon's assault, and it staggered backward. That, I think, is fascinating, that we're being told that one of the reasons that Covenant can even wield the white gold so effectively is because of his leprosy. That shows you how far we've come from the first trilogy. And yet, even in that extravagance of violence, when it's just possible that he has enough violence to simply destroy the Sandgorgon, he doesn't. This Covenant, as I've said in this read-along so far, the Covenant in this second trilogy is a much more likable guy than the Covenant in the first trilogy. And one of the things that makes him that way is that he's dead set against killing if he can avoid it. Instead, he knocks the Sandgorgon back and then somehow makes it understand that if it doesn't kill him, it will be free. It won't have to go back to the gyre. It will be free. And so it kneels in front of him, as we have seen so many creatures in the land and now outside the land kneel in front of Covenant's white gold. And that scene is wonderful. I just love it, and I wanted to use it as an example and also a send-off for this read-along for today of how much I am enjoying this book. Boy, oh boy, can Donaldson write high adventure when he wants to. Boy, oh boy. The fact that he made us stew in misery for the first book is amply repaid in this second book. And that's when we leave. We leave this desert stronghold and this horrible tyrant. That whole thing is wrapped up, and we are now moving on. So we're going to finish this book next week. With the remaining chapters, no need to give chapter numbers or anything like that. We're just going to read it to the end, and I'm, as usual, going to want to know what you make of it all. Especially if you're reading along, what do you make so far? Did you really this adventure in the Sandhold with the Sandgorgons and palace intrigue and all sorts of hissable villains? Just wonderful stuff, just wonderful. And also it helps that all the characters come into sharper focus. The giants, the Harukai, Lyndon Avery, they're all much. This is a quest, in other words, that I could follow for a long time, and that's the key for quest novels. Is that you have to like the people involved. You have to be interested in their interplay. So I'm gonna wrap this up for now. That is our third installment of the One Tree. We'll finish it up next time, and in December we will go on to the White Gold Wielder. So I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.